I am Nina Shea. I direct the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute. And today we're discussing the Confucius Institutes, that is the CCP presence on American university campuses. This is part of a phenomenon called Chinese transnational repression. It's happening on US soil. It's affecting American students, especially those who are Chinese American or who are Chinese exchange students, or those who are interested in and focused on Chinese politics in some way on American campuses. So we have with us two experts who have written reports on this and studied it in depth. We have Ian Oxnevad, who is a senior fellow in foreign affairs and security studies at the National Association of Scholars. And we also have Cynthia Sun, who is a researcher and co-author of a report for Falun Gong on this issue. So welcome. I'm very happy we have your expertise in trying to really get a grasp on this problem of CCP, that's Chinese Communist Party infiltration of American campuses, college campuses. It's been a persistent problem. We've been hearing about it in the news for several years, but it continues. And those of us who have been in colleges or have students, have family members who are students, we've been hearing about some of these problems as well firsthand. So Ian, I'd like to start with you. You have overseen a number of reports on this topic and over 5 years or so. Can you tell us what some of the parameters are? What does this look like? What is the problem? What are Confucius Institutes? Are they still around? There's a lot of confusion about whether this problem has been solved or not. They seem to be not as prevalent as before. Tell us about this.
So the problem that we're really talking about here is CCP influence on campuses. And the motivation for that is multiple. Part of it is soft power projection, or the shaping of perceptions about China, specifically the CCP. Part of it is also access to American universities more broadly for fundamental research purposes, because that has an impact on China's ability to obtain dual-use technologies. Those are technologies that have uses in military or commercial purposes. And then you also have a sort of an elite capture issue with this, in the sense that you are looking at shaping the views of future policymakers and key individuals in America in the future by shaping the views of students today. So Confucius Institutes were just kind of one phase of this. And for those who don't know, Confucius Institutes were basically because there are multiple countries, there's a few left in the US, not many, but these are Chinese language centers that are underwritten by the Chinese government. The teachers that are in these universities, in these programs, they're chosen by the government, and it's run by Chinese government bureaucracies in Beijing. Since there's been a massive pushback on Confucius Institutes, both Confucius Institutes have basically shut down. Oftentimes they're being rebranded as different programs in a non-sort of systematic way. It is systematic on the Chinese side, but they don't have that label anymore. And in terms of the bureaucracies involved, China was cognizant enough of the blowback that Confucius Institutes were receiving to change the name of the bureaucracies that manage this. So now there's several that actually do this. But they're problematic for a number of reasons. They erode intellectual freedom. Oftentimes there's money involved that American campuses receive from China in order to host these institutes, and the contracts involved are very opaque. There's entanglement issues, and they, in the sense that these Confucius Institutes and their replacements, in some cases, have allowed China to monitor dissidents abroad and continue sort of soft power initiatives. So those are some of the
Ian,
main.
Can I interrupt at this point and ask you, what are those contracts? Are they with the government of China, or some branch of the Chinese government, or the universities?
Oftentimes it was, and I can think of a few key examples with this. So basically what would happen is the Hanban, which has been renamed since then, since the pushback has occurred, these universities at the US side would receive funding and materials and teachers from the Hanban, which is basically the Chinese government. They would partner with Chinese universities as well. And this is another aspect of this, that it's not just direct. Well, it is direct, but it's not as necessarily clear cut as a direct bureaucracy interfacing with an American campus. It's also Chinese universities that are basically extensions of the Chinese government, because there's no private Chinese institutions involved we're talking about here.
And the contracts, are they transparent? Do we know does the universities post them on the web, or how do we?
No. So oftentimes the contracts only came to light after they had been signed, often to the chagrin of multiple actors on campus, whether you're talking about the student body, professors, trustees. Many times these were sort of done almost in secret between administrators and China.
And you talk about pushback. What do you mean? Who gave the pushback? Was it the universities and college administration, or what happened there?
Not really the administrators. The pushback came from sort of popular sentiment, professors, the student body in many cases, from across the political spectrum in the US. You also had pushback from policymakers as the threat of China has sort of grown in sort of popular consciousness, particularly since COVID. But over the past few years, that's steadily grown to the point that the brand of Confucius Institutes became toxic. So now what's happening, unfortunately, is that bilateral ties between Chinese universities and American universities are forming in different fields that are more specifically scientific oriented and other programs of that nature, not really Confucius Institutes, because Confucius Institutes themselves really are not the problem. They're just one manifestation of it.
Yeah, well, they were considered by the Chinese government, I think, as an important tool for their propaganda effort. High-level cultural official in China actually was quoted saying that a number of years ago in the Chinese government press. So, I mean, they saw it as an important tool, and I guess they've been replaced by other means. And the CCP presence is certainly still on campuses, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And what's happening is that many schools in the US are forming bilateral ties with Chinese universities that have military ties to the PLA, or the People's Liberation Army in China. And oftentimes these, coincidentally, are American universities that have some sort of defense-related program or department involved. And I can think of a few key examples of that. But that's what's happening now.
So they're specializing, is what you're saying. Is that correct? That there's not just a blanket surveillance of Chinese exchange students, for example. They're specializing in trying to be strategic about which areas of the university they can penetrate.
Yeah, and that's what's happening. So, for example, we had one case that actually came to us. A number of people reached out mentioning Alfred University, which recently shut down its Confucius Institute. It had received a multi-million-dollar contract from the US government to help perfect hypersonic missile technology. And some of the same individuals involved in the engineering ceramics program at Alfred University were also tied to the Confucius Institute. So that was one example. Another thing that we're seeing as well, that we're also currently working on exploring further, is National Centers of Academic Excellence, which seems really innocuous. But these are US campuses that receive DoD or NSA funding, or government funding rather, to basically expand their cybersecurity programs. And oftentimes there seems to be a correlation between the schools that receive this funding and ties to China. And we're seeing that also as well.
Cynthia, I'm going to turn to you. You've also done a report on campuses and the CCP influence on those campuses. Can you tell us, your key findings about that and how you have done this report for Falun Gong Spiritual Group. Can you tell us how that relates to Falun Gong?
Sure. In tandem with what Ian was saying, actually, we saw a lot of physical and digital surveillance by Chinese proxies. So, just to set the scene, nationwide, there are at least 45 universities and colleges with students or faculty who practice Falun Gong on campus. So, on these college campuses, usually they will establish Falun Gong clubs to host events like petition signing, film screenings, art exhibitions to try to raise awareness about the persecution that's been going on for over 24 years now. And in spite of the effort that they're trying to do, the grassroots campaign on advocacy, raising awareness about human rights, there's a lot of reprisals that they face and a lot of consequences that they're unfortunately faced with because they're hosting these events and they're participating in activities in America. So just to give you the scope, the pool of students and faculty include both Chinese and non-Chinese adherents. And from the Chinese adherents, some are second-generation American citizens who have family, elderly relatives back in China. And then there's also Chinese international students who have to go back to China after their studies. And so in this pool of people, there's actually 20% of our survey respondents in our report said they felt uncomfortable self-identifying as a Falun Gong practitioner because of the reprisals that they faced and because of all of the fear they have from the indoctrination, all the propaganda surrounding, their practice.
Yeah, in 1999, I just want to tell our listeners, the president of China at the time, Jiang Zemin, vowed to eradicate, to eliminate Falun Gong from China. And he set up an infrastructure called 610 within the bureaucracies of state and the party to carry this out. And so there have been mass arrests in labor camps, detentions, indefinite detentions without any due process, as well as trials and sentencing and other forms of really harsh punishment for practicing Falun Gong back in China. So what they're concerned about is that the practice continues here, and they use the leverage from what you're saying do I understand this right? Are they
Yes.
using the leverage back in China with people with family members who are themselves students here on exchange and going back to China, that they fear imprisonment or detention or worse?
Yes, and also their family members. So one quote that I have from the survey that I wanted to bring up is a Chinese international student from California said, quote, family members in China were called regarding my whereabouts, my phone number, where I was studying or working. And along those lines, several other students reported feeling watched and their families were harassed due to their activities in the United States. So these are family members that are Falun Gong practitioners and also aren't Falun Gong practitioners, have nothing to do with the faith at all, except that they're family members. And so they're using that as blackmail to threaten and intimidate these students to try to get them to stop holding these activities, holding these events, and exposing the CCP's crimes.
So they want to silence any type of criticism and suppress the profile. They want to suppress the mere presence of Falun Gong as well. And that is it probably, in addition, accompanies what Ian was describing of wanting to learn technology and academic learning about cyber information and so forth on our campuses, spying on the campuses for gathering intellectual property and certain skill sets and levels of learning.
Yeah, for sure. And like Ian was also saying earlier, it's a control of what the party wants people to believe, what the party wants people to say and
controlling
think.
The narrative,
exactly,
the ideological narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so through controlling activities of Falun Gong practitioners, Hong Kong activists, and like other ethnic minorities in China, it's possible for them to also like bring that here, bring the surveillance, the slander, the censorship to the United States of America. Actually, when you were saying earlier about controlling the narrative, there's actually a poignant example of this. I have a friend at the University of Pennsylvania, and she was a graduate student during COVID. And she hosted a virtual screening with on Confucius Institutes with some people that you may be familiar with, and you as well, Ian. Rochelle Peterson, with my friend Rory O'Connor, who's a part of the Athenae Institute. And after the event ended, it's a virtual event, it's a film screening about Confucius Institutes at the University of Pennsylvania, over 79 students and alumni associated with CSSA, the Chinese Student Scholars Association, sent complaints to administration, to the Graduate Student Council. They posted hateful comments on all of the Facebook posts promoting the event. And they made such a ruckus that administration actually hosted 2 roundtables, did not invite the graduate student who's a Falun Gong practitioner, who this was targeting. And they gave a platform for the CSSA members to present why Falun Gong is a cult to administration and to student council.
That's just really outrageous.
And it was, yeah.
Tell us more about CSSA. What is it? What are they supposed to be doing on campus? How prevalent are they? Are they the descendant now, the next generation of the Confucius Institutes? It sounds like it.
CSSAs have been around for over 20 years, I believe.
They're Chinese
Student and Scholars Association. And they're essentially an organization, or supposedly a student organization for Chinese international students to come and celebrate their heritage, celebrate their common interests. And it's actually a proxy of the Chinese state. And a New York student actually said, quote, "The association, CSSA, at our university was very much in the pocket of the Chinese government." And we've seen this with a lot of CSSAs. They're funded by their local Chinese consulate, or the nearest one, and they receive direction also from the Chinese consulate. There was a student in Chicago a few years back who was part of the CSSA because he was also a Chinese international student, but he also happens to practice Falun Gong. And his friend was actually the president of CSSA at the time. And that president received direction from the Chicago consulate to remove the graduate student who practiced Falun Gong off the roster. So he was kicked out of the organization purely based on his faith. And
at the direction of the
Chinese consulate. And you know, the president couldn't do anything about it because he was forced to on that basis. And so I think that just speaks to how much they really are a proxy, and they carry forth this message of continued self-censorship, of continued surveillance, of different incidents where, you know, it's really hard to fathom how this could be happening in American universities. But through CSSAs and through the presence of Confucius Institutes, I think it's very much alive, this, you know, this continued party thought and party culture.
Yeah, I have a young friend who graduated recently from a year ago from a Ivy League university. And he said that during COVID lockdown here, the students were back on campus, but they were having webinars to fill in some of the time when the wave of the disease would come through. And they were talking about, in one of the webinars, someone on the group in the class brought up the zero COVID policy in China and was talking about, complaining about, or pointing out how harsh it was. And there was a group of students, Chinese students, on the call who shut this down and said it was hate speech. And there are other examples. GW University here in Washington, George Washington University, had an exhibit of Chinese protests, political protest posters by an artist, a well-known artist, and that was some Chinese students and their friends, their allies on campus, demanded that they be pulled down, and the president complied. And then he heard the other side. He heard the pushback that this is actually legitimate political speech. And the president, to his credit, reconsidered at George Washington and allowed the posters to be put back. But I wonder if this is all sort of the undercurrent that's going on that is invisible to us on the outside from these student associations. Ian, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, and this is kind of a broader thing that I don't think anyone in the West really fathoms to a mass degree with regards to the CCP. In a totalitarian country, whether it's communist or not, a different ideology, there's no real separation between civil society and the state, at least in the way that that totalitarian state perceives it. So here, you have universities who may see themselves as partnering with benign, independent Chinese universities, or student groups that, in the mind of the universities, these are civil society. They're not tied to the Chinese state. But that's not the case on the Chinese side. These are extensions and proxies of the Chinese state. And if they're not directly fully controlled by the Chinese state, they're certainly influenced by it. So there's no real distinction between private and political life in that sense. And that's something that a lot of universities and the West more broadly doesn't really understand when it's addressing China.
Yeah, that isn't well understood. And, one thing that you've also said, Ian, was that you said to me that the there's certain glamour or prestige with having exchanges with Chinese universities. And I have seen that in my own research on forced organ harvesting, of all things, that the medical schools and medical schools here and hospitals have given a lot to the Chinese Transplant Center, including trained up about 344 transplant surgeons from China. And why did they do it? Why did they share the skills and the knowledge and funding in some cases? Well, a lot of it was, to say that their universities were part of this global expanse of enlightenment or, technology. And it's very, very naive because these are dual use. And you pointed this out in the Alfred University case, that they are really looking for specific advancements to advance the Chinese Communist Party regime in military and science.
Yeah, we're seeing that institutional overlap. Now, to be fair, we didn't find any smoking guns with Alfred, other than a massive close proximity between the Confucius Institute and the ceramics program that was funded by the DoD that was working on hypersonic missile technology. But to your point, the prestige is there, and that's the main incentive for a lot of these universities to develop these programs in the first place, these partnerships. And I've seen universities that have whole pages on their websites devoted to international programs, and you think international programs, and then it has the universities listed, and they all happen to be in communist China. And you see that quite a bit, and partly because other countries are not putting the efforts in to build these bilateral programs to the same degree that China is. You would expect to see other countries present in a lot of these programs, but they're simply not there.
I think your study said, though, that DoD, the Defense Department, leaned on Alfred and said that they would not continue funding their program if they didn't divorce themselves from this program with China.
Yes, absolutely.
I wanted to make a point about that. I feel like in terms of the forced organ harvesting, in terms of Confucius Institutes, and in terms with how universities have displayed their, unpreparedness in reacting to all the Falun Gong transnational repression incidents, it seems like in general, universities are unprepared to deal with Chinese proxies. And that should be changed.
China government proxies.
China government shock. Yeah.
it's almost a willful blindness. I mean, because there is a lot of information. Both of your associations have been publishing a lot of information. We have as well at Hudson Institute. And so there's no dearth of information, but there was a skepticism before COVID. Actually, I think it was when Secretary Pompeo designated the Uyghurs as victims of CCP genocide. And this was in early 2021. The COVID was, we were told it didn't emanate from a lab. It was just an accident, and who knows who did it. And we still don't know the answers to that. But there was a willingness to believe China on these things and to say this is just Trumpian politics or right-wing politics. And I think that has changed. I mean, the Biden administration came in also in early 2021 and said that there's a real problem here with the Uyghurs. This is genocide as well. They validated that finding. And I think there was a greater skepticism then. And around the same time, Xi Jinping, the president of China, was announcing to the world at the Communist Congress that he was going to replace the international world order, the world order that has existed since World War II, led by the United States and built on principles of sovereignty and non-aggression and freedom. So what does that new world order look like? Part of it is, we're seeing it, I think, in this transnational repression on campuses. I wonder what more we can be doing. Ian, you've mentioned a few things. Is there something that you'd like to add to that about what the United States, will the university administrations ever act, or is this going to require some legislation, do you think?
It's going to require legislation, both at the federal and the state level, to be quite frank, because the universities either don't understand it or they simply don't care. Oftentimes, administrators at universities, they may have no background in geopolitical or international, business affairs or anything like that to fully grasp this. And sometimes they simply turn a blind eye to it because there's sort of this sense of almost autonomy in many universities, where they almost envision themselves as a jurisdiction in and of themselves. And so it is going to have to come from the outside. But one thing that has to change, and change very quickly, not just with China, but also with foreign influence on universities more broadly, because we found Russian money present in sensitive areas. We've found Saudi and Iranian influence on other things that we're working on. So this is not just a Chinese specific issue.
One thing that is specific, though, if I could interrupt, is the number of Chinese students in the United States in these colleges. And I think college administrations fear that if they forbid something or kick out a Chinese government-controlled entity or suppress it, that they will be the loser, that the campus will be the loser, that the students will go elsewhere. They'll go to the next state university or the next in the next country.
Sure, and this is a question of educational sovereignty, and this is a political question, valid political question in the U.S. Is why are we educating foreign elites in hostile countries? Why are we educating the middle class for foreign countries that are hostile to the U.S.? That's a bigger question.
Well, I think that question is going to be really hard to solve, but I think that it may be more effective to have legislation or a government order, executive order, stopping these institutes and their proxies and the CCP proxies on campuses, and tying it to finances of the universities.
Yeah, one thing that we have focused on since our second report that came out last year is this idea of ratio funding, which basically mandates that for every foreign dollar of any source from a foreign entity, universities that obtain that funding are then eligible or ineligible rather for an exact same amount from taxpayer sources. And that would change the incentives for universities to enter into agreements.
That's a great idea.
China.
Cynthia, you had work on textbooks as well. Can you describe that? Yeah, can you tell us about the problem and what it is? What
Yeah,
exactly the
so
problem
that's
is? What's the
actually,
solution?
also a solution, also a recommendation. So the Falun Dafa Information Center, our new report actually um, has a recommendation to, within the university, to vet material that's taught like in curriculum for Chinese language classes. And this is really important because last semester, there was a student in Amherst who was taking an intermediate Chinese class, and she found out that her textbook and her homework was basically full of anti-Falun Gong propaganda. It said that Falun Gong will
Really?
drive you to madness, that it was completely superstitious, that there was just a lot of really bad, like I don't even want to repeat it.
This was in the
Amherst, yes.
Amherst language textbook.
And you know what? After she dug into that book, it's actually sold on Amazon. I have a copy of it at home just for research purposes. It's taught in at least 12 other schools, including Yale University, including Southern California, including other universities like across the nation. And it's seen as a reputable textbook. But it also has anti-American sentiment. It also has completely like misconceptions about AIDS, about different campaigns that the CCP is really focused on, controlling the narrative around. And it's just outrageous that that curriculum wasn't vetted, that it wasn't, given a check by someone.
Is that still being used? It's still sold on Amazon, right?
Yes, it's still sold on Amazon. And as of last semester, end of 2022, it was still being used at Amherst University.
We'll have to look into that.
Yes. And
As
so
a Smith
that was,
College grad, I know Amherst very well. And I'm stunned. It's
yeah. And this is only the tip of the iceberg, in my opinion, because we don't know what's being taught at other language classes around, like all around the United States, right? This is only like one that we found,
you sampled. Yeah.
that we sampled. And so that's one of our main recommendations, would be to have someone to vet the curriculum. You could even contact us and we'll go through it for you. But just the fact that this is being taught to American students who are genuinely interested in Chinese culture and learning the language, and then this is what's being indoctrinated and what's going in, because you have to translate that, you have to review it, you have to take a test on it. So it's like, it's really getting in deep.
One of the directors of our Hudson Institute is Mitch Daniels, and he was the president of Purdue University for a while. And in December 2021, he wrote a letter that I like to quote. He says, "Dear Purdue students, staff, and faculty, Purdue learned from a national news account last week that one of our students, after speaking out on behalf of freedom and others martyred for advocating it," that was about Tiananmen, was Tiananmen massacre, was harassed and threatened by other students from his own home country. Worse still, his family back home, in this case China, was visited and threatened by agents of that nation's secret police. And he goes on to say that we're not going to accept this type of intimidation. So I think that there is hope for some universities, and they've been very courageous. Ian, I'll give you the last word.
Yeah, so I think one of the key takeaways to look at this is, universities, there's a desire for openness that is in direct tension with the risks that openness poses in terms of allowing influence from totalitarian countries to be present on campus. And that can take the guise of multiple programs, whether it be student organizations or partnerships with key universities abroad. And that's something that has to change in terms of how our university system is managed and regulated.
Well, thank you, both of you, very much. You're, of course, experts in this. You've studied it and analyzed it systematically, and we're all really benefit from hearing about it. Many of us are just learning aspects of this for the first time. So I owe you a debt of gratitude for doing your work and for joining me today. Thank you very much. This concludes our program.